We literally saw a man being lynched in the streets of America in 2020, and an officer who did not give a fuck about his life.
We're here today with New York State Assemblyman Victor Pichardo, who represents the 86th New York State Assembly District in the Bronx. During this time of crisis, how have you been doing, and what have your days looked like?
I mean, it goes from fairly boring and routine to very chaotic, stress, and hectic. In terms of my official capacity, and again, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about these issues in and around my district and in the Bronx. Law is just trying to get resources to people, get people fed, get people hand sanitizers, masks, PPEs, helping out local community-based organizations. And it's trying to sort of put out fires, like dealing with some issues with NYCHA, to, regular tenant issues, to everything in between. So it's trying to do the job as we normally do, but in sort of a heightened state of crisis. So it's just been difficult, but we've tried to do the best we can to manage it during this time.
What are your thoughts, feelings about the aftermath of the death of George Floyd?
Well, I mean, we've seen this, as I say this snuff film over and over again. Not only with Mr. Floyd, and God rest his soul, but many others, from Eric Garner to Ahmaud Arbery, to all these incidences where we see Black men summarily executed by the hands of law enforcement. And, some people, you have basically three buckets. Some people who are disconnected, who don't care. There are people who are on, the side is like, this is happening constantly, and Black bodies are being assaulted, raped, and destroyed at the hands of law enforcement. And then the other side, where it's like, regardless of what officers do, that they are in the right. If that person would have followed the law, that person would have been alive. If that person would have, not been in that place at that time, they would have been alive. It's such a nonsensical argument, and it's, intellectually cheap, I guess, because, we can talk about, the follow the law nonsense, which is, right, in what circumstances a person have to die over loose cigarettes, right? Whether it did or didn't happen. Why is a person, especially an African-American man, have to die over a $20 bill? Why does a man, Alton Sterling out in Louisiana, have to die over some CDs? But then there was videos, and we've seen this time and time again, where there's people who commit mass shootings who are treated better than people who get caught with a fake $20 bills. So there's a lot of anger, and I'm, for lack of a better term, I'm sort of glad that this country, and what I mean by is the folks who've sort of stayed on the sidelines, who are saying this is bad, and people are now sort of going back and saying, maybe what these activists were saying is right. Maybe what people are saying that's happening in the streets is right. And we see, corporate America with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. I hope it's more than that. But at least there's some spur in action right now in these times. And we hope that there's some positive changes to come down the road because of it.
Have you been able to speak to anybody from the police community?
I've had some on and off conversations with some folks. Some officers feel, afraid to do their job. Some officers feel that they're being attacked on all sides. Some officers get it. But at the same time, there has to be there has to be an acknowledgement, particularly from the law enforcement community, that people from different communities, different socioeconomic statuses, different races and colors of skin are policed and treated differently. Funny enough, I saw a video, literally, it was shared to me on Facebook, where there was looked like a white kid. Officer was giving him orders, pointing a taser at him, must have told him like 20 times. Kid got on the ground, got up, got on the ground, got up, ran to his car, right? And then the officer tased him after all this happened. And then the dude, like, I don't know, when he just screamed at the cop, started chasing the cop, and the cop never discharged his firearm. And this was an exchange that was like maybe 3.5 minutes long. Never discharged his firearm, actually ran away from the suspect. And then the guy got in his car, the dude who got tased, he got in his car and drove away, and the cops never discharged their firearm, right? There was the incident that happened just now in Atlanta. Guy fell asleep at a Wendy's parking lot. It shouldn't have been a point where it escalates to the point where, now a man is dead and his daughters don't have a father, right? So there has to be a recognition and an acknowledgement that this is happening. And I think there is a reality that, particularly that the law enforcement community has to sort of see, that we have to reimagine and think how law enforcement is done in this country. And not every single call requires for an armed officer of the law to show up to respond. So again, there's some concerns. I think there's a lot of frayed and sensitive feelings right now, and on particularly everyone is sort of feeling that pressure. But right now, I think the conversation, what we need to do to move forward is, bring community and police together, have a conversation about what do we do to move forward. And then also we just have to reimagine how law enforcement is done in this country, because we cannot sustain what we've been doing for the last several hundred years in this matter.
So what does the road to police reform look like in order to develop public trust in law enforcement?
Well, I mean, look, me as a legislator, we passed several bills that have to do with open transparency and removing the secrecy in the civil rights law of Section 50A, which the courts have subsequently, since its inception in the 1970s, have made it broader and broader and broader and broader, to the point where you cannot disclose an officer's behavioral record, right? And, some of these officers, particularly, it didn't happen in our jurisdiction, but some of these officers, let's say that happened, Officer Chauvin, and it's been alleged that he's bounced around from department to department because, he's had these allegations levied against him, and so apparently some credible allegations, and, there's no record of it, or there's no one who's doing some follow-up and doing some background check on these people who are supposed to be the face of law enforcement. So, there's the legislative angle. Obviously, there's the community conversation. There's internal reforms that police can do. And again, there's the hashtag defund the police, where a lot of people say, look, I think we should completely abolish police and create a new system. That's a route. I'm in the mindset, and a lot of people that are in government or aren't as sort of hard-leaning would prefer to say, like, is there too much money invested into the law enforcement mechanisms? Absolutely. Is there a way that we can take some of that money or refocus our priorities into different situations, into different entities, like after-school programs, extracurricular activities, community-based organizations that help with getting people money, food, outreach, housing, all that stuff? Absolutely. And then also basically shrinking the portfolio of what officers respond to, right? Because, the cases of there was a mentally distressed or a person who's going through a mental health crisis, and there's a law enforcement officer with a firearm that responds, right? Is that really necessary? And we have to start to think about real ways, because training, we can talk about training till we're blue in the face. We can talk about, moving certain policies internally within the police department and letting them to their own devices. And I'm not necessarily picking on PD. I'm talking about all law enforcement agencies across this country. But then again, the results are still the same. And then also what I heard actually, which is actually pretty it's pretty makes sense, right? But it does not talk about is that there is a diversity issue within a lot of law enforcement agencies, including the NYPD, right? So there was a DeRay McKesson who has a podcast was talking about these 6 points that talks about how do you really reform police, and one of the things is increased diversity, right? And again, having a law enforcement that is reflective of their communities and understand their communities tends to lead to less bad shootings and better sort of community and police relations, because you have people from the community who have some credibility that can reach and talk to people, like a lot of the stuff where we're doing like violence interruptions and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things that we have to have in terms of a conversation. But regardless, at the very least, and it's sad to say that it took the life of a man basically being choked out and lynched in public to have this conversation, because we've been pushing this for a while. But I'm at the very least, if there's a silver lining in all this, at least there's this conversation that's happening.
I'm glad that you brought up the tragedy of it, and also the legislation of 50A.
Yep.
These reforms and these proposals, they didn't just drop out of the sky. So why does it have to take a tragedy like this for government, at least local and state government, to do something about it?
Well, I mean, I don't know if we have enough time in this interview to sort of go into this, but here's sort of the basic tenets, right? There is a lot of sway and influence that a lot of the police union and law enforcement unions have amongst not only in the legislature in New York, but across this country, right? You don't want to cross police politically. Right? Secondly, there has to be the political will and courage to do it. And thirdly, because we all live in these bubbles, elected officials in general, assembly members, state senators, a lot of the concern is to survive to the next election, right? So when we won the majority in 2018, which was a godsend to say the least, a lot of the things that we did were great, right? The DREAM Act and Green Light, and particularly, if you saw the local coverage of, let's say, bail reform, right? A lot of my colleagues on both sides in both houses were saying, we need to scale this back. We need to roll this back. And what happened was, the issue of actually moving to the point where there is actual justice for all, where you don't get justice served because of your bank account. A lot of it was moved back, not because of policy, but because of politics. But it cuts both ways, right? We saw this tragedy, and it came to the point where some of these other members from more conservative districts, and I'm saying in both parties, started getting some pushback from their constituents saying like, yo, this is a really screwed up situation. Like, y'all need to do something about it. Right. And then that's when, at least myself, speaking for myself and many of my colleagues in the Black Caucus, we're asked to sort of carry the load in the water for a lot of members who come from more conservative districts. And it's about sort of making sure that they come back so we can push our agenda. But we got tired of it. Like, we really got tired of it. I have to commend particularly Speaker Hasty, Chairwoman Tremont Wright from Brooklyn, many of my colleagues within the caucus, and we were like, we're done. This happens or nothing else happens. And it happened because there was a political will, there was a political momentum, and the opportunity was right to do these bills. We should have done them earlier, absolutely. But again, it was about a lot of people sort of use this, and I'm not saying this in specific, but sort of generally when we talk about these sort of controversial issues, quote unquote, that how will this affect me politically back home? And there's some members who, have a lot of police officers who live in their districts and are scared to piss them off. And I understand sort of the political motivation about self-preservation. I get that. But we literally saw a man being lynched in the streets of America in 2020, and an officer who did not give a fuck about his life sat on his knee, put his hand in his pocket, and was like, oh, did I turn off the stove? Oh, I need to check my Facebook status. Like, it was that callous that I think it was, and then sort of the officer standing behind them, like, this is like, oh, this is routine. Like, I think it shook America to its core to look at itself and say, this is what's happening in our communities, and it's being recorded, and we need to do something about it now. And I'm glad that we are doing something about it now.
I feel like I get it, the take that I get from it in a sense. I'm not saying that this is the overall, like, yeah, let's do this, but
Sure.
there had to be like and again, this is just me reading the tea leaves. This is just me reading the tea leaves, that there are members of the police and just law enforcement that were okay with the reforms moving forward.
Sure. I mean, look, there may be an element of that, but at least a public-facing opinion through the Patrolmen's Benevolence Association, some of the other law enforcement associations, the letters that were published publicly, some of them said these cowardly politicians are adhering and listening to hard left-leaning radicals who don't care about safety in communities. The president of the Patrolmen's Benevolence Association called elected officials who supported a lot of these reformed opportunists, and did a press conference and railed against the changes in reform. I don't understand. I get, as a union, that your reaction and your reflex to support your members. But if we talk about, most of the cops are good, fine. But there's a few bad apples that spoil the bunch. Why are you protecting the bad apples? Right? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. So why are you sort of creating this political maelstrom, saying that if you believe and support reform, what you're doing is you're supporting the criminal class, and we've been called the criminal lobby. Like, I personally cannot have conversations with people who cannot see sort of the humanity of other people, two, the way law enforcement has been done in this country for centuries at this point, that it's not about enforcing the laws, it's about enforcing norms, and that certain people have more rights within this republic than others. And it is incredibly apparent. But time and time and time and time and time and time again, what tends to happen is that when these tragedies happen, when these lynchings happen, right, there's 40 million excuses. This guy had a record. This guy wasn't a good guy. And you can dig up dirt and everything. But then nothing about the officer, right, who perpetrated this, right? It took 5 years for this city to move for justice for Eric Garner, who was killed in Staten Island because of 50A secrecy, right? So, and apparently the officer Panaleo had a record of these instances and these complaints levied against him, but no one knew it, right? So, if you believe, right, that there are good cops, because I've interacted with many police officers, particularly in my district, and especially the community affairs officers. We've worked very well together on community events and helping people and getting information out to folks. But as a union, as a leadership structure within the NYPD or any law enforcement agency, why is your initial reaction to protect the bad apples? And I think what we did is basically force law enforcement hand to basically turn over those bad apples so we can weed them out, and that officers who want to do their 9-to-5s or their shifts, go home to their families, do the right thing by people, that they can do that, and then it's not cast as a broad brush as everybody. So, I don't think there was a permission structure given. I think that it was the old Russian adage that you should fear the general behind you than the enemy in front of you. And some people made that political calculus that if we did nothing as a state, then everybody would come down and bearing down on them, regardless of the politics of it.
The call to defund. In situations like this, civil unrest, social, racial, we tend to talk past each other. Explain to the people what exactly is meant by the defunding of the police.
Sure. So look, I think there's different variations of this conversation. And I think, some political opportunists, particularly on the sort of more conservative side of the spectrum, are basically saying that this is every position in the Democratic Party. When they say defund the police, it is literally zero out the police, and basically abolish law enforcement forever, right? Whether or not there's a mechanism to replace it, that's a different story. A lot of people within particularly the sort of the center of the country in terms of politics and the Democratic Party is a little bit more nuanced and varied. Right? I myself, the idea of completely abolishing police, I don't know if it's feasible, even workable. But at the very least, I think what is the value of this conversation about defund the police is a valuable conversation, not only as a sort of a political exercise, but also as like what exactly, in terms of our tax dollars, what are we investing in to keep our community safe, right? We can look after study after study. If you put more money in law enforcement, right, more guns that have to do with sort of like severe issues with like, robberies, gunplay, the whole thing, there is no discernible drop in crime the more money you put into these departments, right? When you invest into structures that like have to do with getting, getting kids more support during after school hours, right? So through after school, through extracurricular activities, helping people create or find stable housing, having people find or create stable jobs for themselves and their family. That has a much more demonstrable impact on crime rates than pretty much anything else, right? So this idea of defund the police has become sort of like a catch-all, which is sort of broad and very nebulous. But I think what it really comes down to is we need to reprioritize, one, what we invest our money into, right, in terms of crime prevention or quality of life issues. There's also the issue of shrinking, right, the portfolio of officers, right? So they're doing less things because unfairly government and society has given police officers a pretty broad portfolio to deal with a broad set of issues that some may or may not be able, trained, or capable of dealing with, and hence why you may have situations like this. And then thirdly, again, how much sort of military firepower should law enforcement have, right? The use of tear gas, the use of M4 assault rifles, and particularly M4 platforms and all the variations, armored personnel carriers, full-on body gear and stuff like that. And the reason why that conversation is happening is that during COVID, because we're still going through it, we saw nurses, doctors, healthcare practitioners walking around hospitals in garbage bags around their bodies and plastic, shopping bags around their hands because there wasn't enough money for gloves or PPE that was saving lives. But yet, an officer was armed to the teeth in dealing with protesters. So there's a conversation that should be had. I think really the conversation about defund the police is a much more broader and less defined than most people think. But there are elements who said, do away with the police, defund them completely, invest in communities, period. And that's done, which I don't know if there is the ability, the support within broad spectrums of the American public to do that. But I think a conversation about refocusing what we do with law enforcement and refocusing our money into different programs, I think it's a sort of a much better way of where we can go.
You mentioned COVID.
Yeah.
Do you have any concerns about spikes occurring due to the ongoing protests?
There's obviously a concern, right? Because social distancing issues, some people refuse to wear masks in public. Some people are not, say this bluntly as possible, not keeping up with basic hygiene, like washing their hands frequently, that kind of stuff. So there may be a spike. But some people are just so frustrated with the system, particularly how it treats men and women of color, because we can't forget, unfortunately, Black women who've been cut down by police gunfire are so frustrated that they're willing to risk, in certain instances, their own lives to sort of push this political conversation forward. So there's obviously a concern. I know that, for me and my part, what I try to do, because I have participated in some of these demonstrations, is as best as I can keep social distancing around my physical person, wear masks in public, gloves in public if you can, and then as soon as you get home, kind of leave your clothes to sort of away from the rest of your house, and then shower and take proper precautions. So we have to, and people need to feel the need to sort of exercise their First Amendment right to approaching their grievances with the government. But what I ask folks, and I always say this, is to be careful when you go out in public, that you're not harming yourself or putting others in harm's way. But again, there's this concern. Again, the incubation period is about 14 days. So, pretty much it's sort of monitored. And I think the state itself has done a fairly good job in dealing with this crisis, but obviously we can do more. But again, there's obviously concern. And as we see people in public, asking them to wear masks and maintain social distance, I think it's sort of the best way where we can balance a person's need to exercise their First Amendment right, but also keep others and themselves in sort of out of harm's way.
So you are a member of several committees that have, in fields where there's been many challenges due to COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
One of them is the Committee on Small Businesses.
Mm-hmm.
So
are there any strategies that small businesses can utilize in order to help them during the summer and prepare them for a potential second wave and a potential second lockdown?
Well, my district, as you know, Ricardo, was hit with like kind of a double whammy. So right when the protests really started to take hold of our streets, right, there was an incident on Fordham Road and on Burnside a couple weeks back where a lot of the businesses were destroyed and looted. And some of these businesses just opened up as part of phase one. And one of the business owners that I had a conversation with, she owns a optical store right on the corner of Burnside and Jerome. And her entire inventory was wiped out. Glass, windows, everything destroyed. And they had no cash flow because they've been closed for months. So they were hit with a double whammy. Fordham too. There was fires. Jimmy Jazz was broken into. Like everything was wiped out. It was crazy. So, what I've been doing personally in those things, and what we try to help small businesses with, is on the state level, there's the Department of Financial Services, right? And particularly these businesses that have been hit hard on Fordham and Burnside and on the Grand Concourse. Myself and some of my colleagues, my colleagues in different levels of government who represent overlapping areas, we've been having conversations. We've been coordinating together. We've been trying to get SBS, who's been there. We've been working with a local community-based organization on Burnside, the Davidson Community Center, who's helped coordinate relief efforts for the small businesses and get them access to certain grants. The mayor announced that there's a $500,000 grant that's going to be specifically targeted to these businesses that were hit. But again, we have to do more, right? So it's about unlocking capital and helping them sort of catch up with their rent, which is sort of the biggest concern for a lot of these small businesses. And then making sure that whatever their insurance policies do cover, and they get that money as quickly as possible. And that's where I think myself and many of my colleagues have come in to try to bring those resources to bear for these small businesses. But it's difficult because each business has a different relationship with the owner of the building, or a different status in terms of where they are in their lease, whether or not, and the crazy other thing too, Ricardo, was because COVID was been going on so long, some of these business owners is insurance policies lapse because there's no cash flow, right? So what do you do to help them? And I think we're coming up with some creative solutions. And I have to say that, you know, myself, and I know that we've been working with Governor Cuomo's office as well as Mayor de Blasio's office, small business services, and we're just trying to help these businesses out and work through case by case basis, but also, you know, Davidson Community Center, their executive director, Angel Caballero, and everybody on their staff have been working day and night, not only helping these businesses, helping feed the community, making sure that they have hand sanitizers, masks, and everything. And it's just a team effort in trying to making sure that we build these businesses up. But, you know, we try to help as many people as we can if they come to us asking for help.
So the businesses that have been looted, you've
Mm-hmm.
mentioned businesses on Fordham.
Mm-hmm.
How does that really does set them back?
Oh yeah,
in this recovery.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's because again, there's no cash flow, right? If you have a business and you have your insurance up to date, and if you have sort of money just circulating and stuff moving around, you could always move stuff around. You could, you know, you could figure a way out forward, for the most part. But you don't have that, right? So it's just, what do you do, right? And even if some people had some reserve money and reserve cash, their insurance was up to date and paid for, maybe certain policies don't cover these type of instances, you know? So we do this on a case by case basis. We work with the folks on the ground and the small businesses and the local bids and merchants association and the Fordham bid particularly, in trying to get them stuff and squared away. But it's just helping them as they come, and really what we can do, making sure whatever paperwork that needs to be processed gets processed, but also have them and give them access to capital, which is probably the most important thing that they need in the here and now.
What, if any, movement has there been on the debate on rent freezes?
Well, we passed a bill a couple of weeks ago that gave about $100 million in rent relief to certain tenants who fit certain criteria. I myself still believe that there has to be either some sort of rent forgiveness or rent freeze, because there's some people who lost work because of COVID, who couldn't go back to work, or it took them a long time to get access to enhanced unemployment benefits, or PUA, which was the COVID enhanced uninsurance policy for the Department of Labor. So I think at the end, we have to come back and deal with this. There was some reluctance to do this, and I think we could have done more, but there was a lack of flexibility that was built into the money that we got from the federal government. There wasn't enough to go around, but I think those conversations are still happening. And the fact that, you know, myself, and I know that Speaker Hasty, and I've spoken to some of my federal colleagues, and as well as the speaker and the leadership in our house has spoken to our federal colleagues, particularly Leader Schumer and Congress member Hakeem Jeffries, and other folks within the leadership of the Democratic House, is that once we're supposed to get more stimulus money that's a little bit more flexible in terms of what we can spend it on. So hopefully what we can do with that is try to figure out a way to help people get back on their feet as quickly as possible, because that's going to be the thing that helps get our economy back on its feet.
So there is federal help coming.
Fingers crossed. They said, and, you know, Leader Schumer basically said that as other states, particularly states who are represented by more conservative members, start getting hit really hard by COVID, that there's a little bit more of an incentive for them to be like, okay, yeah, we need to download some more dollars. So there's that concern, there's that conversation. But at the end of the day, like, you know, if we don't get any help from the feds, let me just put it this way. We're at about a $14 billion deficit right now in the state of New York. That we're about 60% short on our tax receipts, right? Because we pushed back the tax filing date to July, we don't know what we're going to get till another couple of weeks from now. So we're short about $14 billion. The governor has the authority right now to make 20% cuts across the board. That's everything. School, housing, healthcare, roads, everything, just to sort of make up the deficit, because by statute and the Constitution of the state of New York, we have to have a balanced budget, period, full stop, every year. If we don't, then there's sort of cuts that are automatically taken. So we have an incentive as a legislature to come back and deal with these issues. But the conversations that we have had with our leadership has been, we need to figure out what the feds are doing first. If they're sending us money, if they are, fantastic. Hopefully it's what we need. And that we can sort of deal with figuring out where we can move money, make cuts, make some savings here and there to balance our budget, because we need to, and we have to, by law and by statute.
What do you think needs to be done to move the rent freeze along?
Well, I think really it comes down to more money, and whatever money we get from the federal government, a little bit more flexible. And, you know, the crux of the issue, particularly members who have been saying this, has been like, if we cancel rent, the money effectively stops circulating within the local economies, right? So landlords can't pay their locals water and sewer tax, they can't pay their property taxes, they can't do this. And then, you know, we find ourselves short in state coffers, which means that we have to cut down more programs, which eventually has to circle back, which makes sense, right? It's sort of, the economy theoretically should work as a circle because money should be circulating throughout the economy. But again, what we need to reckon that with and reconcile that with is that once these moratoriums are lifted, the first date is the 20th and the next time is August 21st. Once these moratoriums are lifted, people can't pay their rent. That means a lot of people are going to be taken to housing court, which means a lot of people are going to be evicted, which means we're going to have another crisis on hand where we don't have enough housing stock to house folks who are homeless, which means it's going to cost the state even more money to deal with this, right? So what we've been having these conversations on is that we need to do more now to avoid this situation of people being evicted from their homes, which is going to cost the government more in the long run, and try to figure out a way to create either some rent cancellation or at least some rent forgiveness, or give people sort of like almost like a one-shot deal on a sort of a wide scale to help sort of make up at least a partial part of their rent and give people a longer runway to pay whatever they owe in the background. Because I think that would probably be the best way forward to not stop having money circulate in the economy, but also avoid a housing crisis that this city has not seen in decades. So, I mean, something has to be done. I don't know what permutation or form that's going to take in the near future.
Let's talk about education and everything that has come with virtual learning, the struggles that a lot of family members have had, and just the implementation of it, the lack of materials needed for each student. Have you seen, the school year is practically over, or it is over. Towards the tail end, have you seen any progress made in, or have you heard any feedback in how the virtual learning has gone on? And also, do you think virtual learning is going to be incorporated moving forward into the public schools?
It's kind of hard to say. I sort of feel that this was really put together very quickly because a lot of us are flying in the dark. I myself am a parent of a 7-year-old girl, and I had to spend many, many mornings with her helping with her math, and I'm terrible at math, to say the least. So I think there might be conversations about incorporating some sort of element like that. But it's, again, you have to kind of figure out whether or not the infrastructures exist and that these can take place, right? So the Department of Education spent millions upon millions of dollars of getting smart devices to parents and to students so that they can do online learning, right? There were issues with infrastructure, like, you know, the internet when we talk about, who has access to high-speed internet and who doesn't, who has the money to pay for this utility, who doesn't, right? So there has to be a sensitivity where there has to be a floor that everybody can reach, and then we can sort of work and have a conversation. I think what's the most important thing that we have to focus on and think about is that we need to do a better job as parents, educators, community, government, of making sure that all students have the resources that they need to succeed, and particularly students who either have English as a second language or even students who have other special needs, that they are given the resources that they need and deserve. And then third and finally, we need to make sure that we're not having teachers foot the bill for them to do their jobs, right? And look, I think a lot of these things have been sort of an interesting experiment, to say the least. And I think there are valid points to have a conversation about increasing the quality of education across the board. I'm looking forward to participating in those conversations, but just looking and putting this in the future, I don't know how this is going to take shape. I think the fall of this year is going to be sort of a mix of both, but how it works, it's kind of hard to tell right now.
So is there anything you want to say that we haven't discussed or talked about in this interview?
I think really, you touched on it again, Ricardo. I appreciate the time as always, brother. I think really it's just, we saw in these last couple of weeks, being pissed off and angry is a hell of a motivator. But I think really we have to engage and be part of the process of change before these catastrophic events happen, and then after, which I think is the most important. I think the idea of civic participation, whether you show up and vote every presidential primary, everything else like that, I think is incredibly important. If you show up for a movement, a protest and stuff like that, that's great, that's important, making sure that you exercise your voice. It's just, I think we need to be just generally more engaged, more focused, more active citizens on all spectrums. And I think that will do sort of a better job of making sure, A, government is more responsive, B, the things that we want to focus on and fund are done as such, and that these conversations and decisions that are made on behalf of hundreds of millions of Americans aren't done in the dark or done in a way that it only benefits a small section of the population. So I think it's just being civically engaged, being involved, having these conversations, that it's really important. And then just making sure that people know that there is a power in their voice and in their activism. But more importantly, that, we need to make sure that we stay engaged and we stay involved.
Assemblyman Victor Pichardo, we're going to have to do this again sometime, because
I'm happy to do it, brother, man.
There's so much that I wanted to ask, and I know, you're a very, very busy man. Again, thank you for your time to talk to me.
Sure.
Thank you for all the work that you're doing, and hope to see you soon.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate you. You stay safe, and we'll chat soon, man.